Growing up, Remembrance Day was a big, serious deal. Every year, my father, Cecil, would assemble his outfit well ahead of time, with his shoes spit-shined and medals polished. He would then meet up with my Uncle Dick in Chinatown and march in the Remembrance Day parade. He did this every year of my life until his passing in 1989, and often did this with tears in his eyes. Clearly, it meant a lot to him. I knew very little about what my father and my Uncle Dick did during the war. Every time I asked Dad what it was like, but he would just shake his head and remain silent. I wasn't there, and he couldn't explain it. Then, a decade ago, I made a startling discovery while reading Saltwater City by Paul Yee. There, on page 111, was a picture of a large group of Chinese-Canadian men deployed to Pune, India. I recognized his face instantly, barely bothering to read the confirming caption. Front, left to right, Herbert Lim, Willie Chong, back, Larry Goon, Dick Yip. It was then that I first learned about the extraordinary story of my Uncle Dick and Chinese-Canadian men like him, who were once a part of a unit called Force 136.
Well, as far as I know, is that the Chinese immigrant that came to Canada, I guess at the time, were mostly people that coming from a big influx from the States. There was a big gold rush here in the BC, in the Fraser River, and that's in about roughly 1870s, around that time. And of course, when they built the CPR railway, they brought in a lot of Chinese labor to build the railway, and that was completed in 1885.
Cecil Wing Yip, my dad, was born in 1922, and it was the year before the Chinese Exclusion Act. His brother was born the year after. It would have been a very interesting time to grow up, because at one point, of course, they were the grandchildren of a wealthy and prominent merchant, Yip Sang, but at the same time, they were also limited to living and being in Chinatown, because stepping outside of it, Dad used to say, you definitely had to learn to defend yourself if you stepped outside Chinatown. So it was a rough place to grow up, but with a large family at the center.
Mostly the Chinese people, where I live in Chinatown, what they call Government Street. After that, I do a lot of delivering Chinese paper around Chinatown, and when I was about 14, 15, I help out at the restaurant. At the same time, go to English school, and after that, I come back and go to Chinese school for 2 or 3 hours. And then from there, every day have the same opportunity to work in this restaurant down Chinatown, cleaning dishes, which I was at that age. When I was a kid, we're not allowed to go swimming in the swimming pool. Any public affair going on, you're not allowed. Even to go to theater, they put you in one spot up or back of the theater. It's quite those days. I look at it, but right now, those days when I was 18, we didn't know any better.
My father never spoke of what it was like growing up. He did say that Chinatown was tough. I know that he went to Chinese school, but for all of their education, both my father and my Uncle Dick, they were limited in the opportunities that they could pursue. The tension between the white majority and the Chinese minority was that, thanks in part to the Chinese Exclusion Act, thanks in part to 200-some laws enacted by British Columbia, a Chinese person simply couldn't get a break, shall I say, in terms of getting work. And so Dad did what work he could, and he worked at wood fiber, in kitchens, at the cannery, and it was difficult to build a career. Let's put it that way.
They were restricted or confined to the Chinatown area, even though they were able to work outside of the Chinatown. They became servants and houseboys and cooks and all that for those who are living outside of the Chinatown area. But the majority were only able to live in Chinatown. Another thing too is that because the fact that they were living in Chinatown, they had no opportunity to develop, and not being able to vote, they have really no way of finding a better life for themselves. And even if you were born in Canada, their certificate says that you are, there's no legal status for you to be anyone in Canada, for that matter.
So in 1931, Japan was trying to look for resources and saw Manchuria as a northeastern China as a source. And they set up a false flag operation in Mukden and bombed a rail line and then blamed it on the Chinese. We used that as a way to get into China, into Manchuria, and captured all of Manchuria. So in 1937, Japan decided to attack the rest of China, attacking around Beijing and also in Nanjing. November 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Hong Kong, and then within 2 weeks had seized it. They also attacked British Malaya and Singapore later, and over into 1942 captured Singapore and Malaya. So prior to Pearl Harbor, the Canadian government decided to declare war on Germany, and started mobilizing both the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The Army sent over the 1st Canadian Division, and actually one brigade was in operations in France before Dieppe, and then they returned to England. So the Canadian Army was in England on division. On the Navy side, they immediately started protecting ships that are leaving Halifax or other parts of Canada. And the Air Force's airmen actually joined along with the British in the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. So all 3 elements were involved, basically around England.
When the war broke out in 1939, there was a debate in Chinatown. Should we or should we not fight for a country that do not consider us as their citizens? And of course, there's the different factions in Chinatown. One group says that we should not bother joining this particular war effort. Another group says, look, we should fight for Canada to show that we are loyal to Canada, we are Canadians. All our friends that from school were enrolling and joining the military. Why shouldn't we go fight? And when we come home after the war is over, we can then tell the government, look, we can fight and die for the country. Why cannot we be the full citizens and have the franchise?
All of us, so we join up, and as you say, we have an opportunity. Maybe we will come back, ask for the opportunity to be a Canadian. But at that time, I didn't know I wasn't a Canadian. I was a British subject.
They weren't called up, because that's what happened to Chinese soldiers, is even if they were able to sign up, which many were prevented from signing up at all, they were on the list, but then they weren't called. The Eastern Theater realized that it had a place for people who looked like my dad and his brother.
The situation in the Pacific Theater was basically Japan had seized a large portion of the Pacific nations, and the British were concerned about defending India and Burma, and they developed a thing called, through the SOE, called the Indian Mission. That's what it was original name. and it's set up in India in Ceylon. And as the Japanese advanced, they started developing operatives to go behind Japanese lines.
Britain had all these colonial possessions in Asia. They were not able to infiltrate the Japanese. So they said, well, who do we go to have people that can fight for us or, work for us? Well, they found out there's Chinese people in Western Canada that came from China, and they can speak the language. They look Chinese, they look Asian. So the British government expressed, their desire for the Canadian government to bring in Chinese into the armed forces.
One of the officers from Britain come over Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, that would ask us if we would like to volunteer to work, to go over Southeast Asia instead of go to Europe. At that time, when you join up like that, right, you're allowed to join up, you go for it, right? You don't worry about what happened. Because when you're 18-year-old, every one of us ready to join the army, to be proud. That's what it's all about.
Now, when Dick's file shows that he was a particularly promising soldier. He was gifted in math, physics, chemistry. Both he and my father were athletic. They played soccer, they were on the track team. And when Dick went through basic training, he was seen as being someone with potential. So he took an extra week at basic in artillery. And at that point, they asked him if he would consider going overseas for a special volunteer assignment.
They train in the different, aspects of a commando operation, guerrilla warfare, working with dynamite, working with radio codes and so forth.
I would train as a demolition expert. After that document is finished, they sent us over to India. And we are in India, we're a place called Pune. That's what they call is a British base. It's called Sinker Hill. So we took a lot of training at Sinker Hill, and it was supposed to be advanced training for us in the Canadian version of it. I didn't like the jumping, so I was transferred to land element, what they call go by boat or go by whatever, any transportation for us.
The Eastern Warfare School, or EWS, specialized in jungle tactics, things like silent killing, blowing things up, wireless management, and living on bamboo, using bamboo as a weapon, as well as parachuting to be dropped behind enemy lines. I think when Dick got to India and saw the other 100+ members of Force 136, it must have sunk in even harder as to the danger of the kind of work that he'd be doing.
The real danger was the actual jungle, living in the jungle, moving through the jungle, in terms of your health and just tiredness and humidity. And then, of course, behind that was, of course, where the Japanese were. They were in enemy lines, behind enemy lines. So that was secondary. It was living in the jungle and surviving.
The British the intelligence people already planned where we're going at that time. At that time, I didn't know where we're going. That's how, if we go in there, do the damage, whatever, we track or depot or field depot or thing like that. That's the way I look at it, is actually a suicide squad.
I think, we need to define what is courage. Courage isn't the absence of fear. I think courage is being incredibly afraid, facing that fear, knowing what you're going to do, and getting up and doing it anyway. And for this, the entirety of both my father and my uncle's time in the war, I think they faced that on a daily basis. They knew what they were getting into, and yet they still did it. And that, yeah, I don't know how they did it. I don't know how I would face something as literally world-shaking as a world war. So Dick was in Pune, ready to take parachute training and to drop behind enemy lines when, in August, the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The immediate effect of those bombs, aside from the incredible death, was that Japan immediately surrendered. And so the need to drop members of Force 136, those missions over Burma, was immediately erased because the Japanese were coming out of all of their places in all over Southeast Asia and surrendering to the first ally that they could see. So there was no need to continue this part. So what actually happened was the Eastern Warfare School was dismantled.
I was in the jungle, and then lucky the part of that, I didn't know the war still was going on until one of the officers come in and say the war is over. That was funny. And then he explained to us that they dropped the atom bomb in Japan. And then we didn't know actually about 4 or 5 days later.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
The greatest news story of all time. Final unconditional surrender with the whole world waiting to celebrate.
It's fortunate and unfortunate too. They want to see action, but by the time they were ready to be deployed, the Americans dropped the bomb in Japan. And so they were able to stand down. And when the second bomb was dropped, they were sort of say, okay, you can stay put, and they will send you home afterwards. So for those who actually signed up to go and work there, they were told that it's a one-way trip, and yet they all came home.
You know, families would have been incredibly grateful to have their family members back because their sons and daughters are their investment in the country. You know, they are the reason why people immigrate to the country. But the Official Secrets Act also would have kept Dick and Cecil from speaking about it. And I think it would have been extremely difficult for them to come back to Canada hoping for a better future and having the same Canada.
But there are two, sides to it. Elation that you survived the war, and then also the fact that you missed an opportunity to, really serve the country to, make a difference in the war effort.
It would have been kind of a shock for Dick and Cecil to have the war end because they were so ready, so primed to fight, and wearing the uniform, so proud to be soldiers and for such a short period of time, and to be met with silence.
Or we come home, and a group of veterans in Victoria and in Vancouver or even across Canada, we went
They went, I did. They would have a group, have a conversation about get the right to vote for us. So a group of people from Vancouver and Victoria went to Ottawa. So the group went to Ottawa, challenged the government about the regulation. So when they come home later on, I think, a couple of years later, they changed the act in 1947, and then we were Canadian.
The Dominion Elections Act was rewritten to allow all Chinese Canadians to vote. At that point, Doug Jung, who actually was able to run for office doubly because he was not only a veteran and therefore able to vote, but also a Chinese Canadian. And that was probably a time that no Chinese Canadian would have anticipated prior to the war.
After the war, come back a little bit, still discrimination there until we get the right to vote. As soon as we got the vote, a right to vote, things change. People go to university, become lawyer, become doctor, everything like that. That's what's changed. And then we're allowed to go to swimming pool. We can do a lot of things that when I was young, that I know we can't do that. My friend either own a grocery store or else own a laundry room. That's a difference.
Yes, it was great being able to talk to my friends about my dad being a veteran, getting recognized, the work he was doing with the Chinese community. And this way I get to know more about what Dad doesn't tell me because I learn things not only from him, but the people who are interviewing him, because they have background information that I never heard of.
You know, I put myself in their shoes because they had no words. You know, they couldn't tell their own story. Dick was just a teenager, really. He was in his late teens. My father was in his early 20s. And I think for two people like them, optimistic, looking towards the future, they dreamed of a better life. That's why they signed up. And I think also because the Chinese weren't called up until very late in World War II, that they wanted the opportunity to prove that they were just as good as every other Canadian in serving king and country. And putting the uniform on was a real source of pride.
Most of the Canadian Chinese or Canadians of Chinese extraction do not know of the history of how the Chinese in Canada were treated and how they had to fight their way or under the very trying conditions of being discriminated to find a place in this society. And the Chinese veterans that of Canadian extraction or living in Canada were the ones who actually make a difference. They're the ones that fought for Canada. They're the ones that make us know that we are not aliens in this country. We're part of Canadian fabric, we're part of society. And as a result of their effort and their blood and sweat, we're able to get the citizenship and be able to be full citizens of this country.
These people put their lives on the line and were willing to do it even though they weren't accepted as Canadian citizens in World War II. And then the legacy for the country is also to learn about these people because it's really an unknown story.
Discrimination is still here, but not as like before. Now, it wasn't for the veteran fight for the rights. All the people from Hong Kong and China won't be able to come here. It wasn't for, because they all forgot about it. A lot of Chinese people come here for us. It wasn't for us. Maybe they might have a chance to come.
When we look back, it was not a slam dunk. It was not a given that the Allies would even win, and that these 100 plus important sons and daughters of Chinatown to stand up and to believe in something that the government didn't want them in shows heroism at a mass level, and a huge sense of pride, I think, in being Chinese Canadian.